Hey, Young Pros, we're in week 3 of this amazing story in Esther. It's a story of mystery and intrigue and good guys and bad guys and twists and turns. And wait till we get to the end, this incredible, almost dark humor irony that's in the story as well. But remember, we've been using the 3-act structure that Robert McCalla talks about in his book, Story. There's Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 of any great story. Act 1 is where we're introduced to the character. So in Esther chapter 1, we might say, once upon a time in a land far, far away on the other side of the world, the Persian Empire, a long time ago, it was 2,600 years ago, lived a powerful, rich king, King Xerxes. We're introduced to this guy. In fact, he was so powerful, remember chapter 1 talks about him putting this celebration to flaunt his power and wealth that went on throughout the entire kingdom for 6 months. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of power. And then remember, for 7 days at the end of that, he comes back to his capital of the Persian Empire. And for 7 days, he has what we might call a drunken party going on because he's got wine flowing freely. You can drink as much as you want, and people are taking advantage of that. A lot of drunk people. King Xerxes gets a little tipsy, and he decides that he wants his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, to come in and dance around with her crown. And a lot of commentators, a lot of Bible scholars believe that he was asking her to dance around with only her crown. Something bothered her clearly because inciting incident. Remember, the inciting incident in any story launches the characters on a quest, on a journey. Their lives will never be the same. This changes the story for the lives of Queen Vashti, for King Xerxes, for Esther, for Mordecai, and the others that are going to come in this story. Inciting incident. Queen Vashti is told to come dance in front of a bunch of drunk men, and she says, "No way, I'm not doing that." So his men come to him and say, "Hey, King," clearly a bunch of sexist men, because they come to him and said, "King, we can't have a bunch of women defying their men. So you got to do something about this." So he banishes Queen Vashti. A lot of time passes. Remember, the story of Esther covers about 10 years total. A lot of time passes. They come to him with another idea, these sexist men. They come to him and say, "You know what you should do is you should have a beauty contest." Remember, this isn't a Disney princess story. This isn't like some women are going to volunteer to come and flaunt their beauty. They're actually taken. These men go out in the kingdom. This is human trafficking 2,600 years ago. And they take these women. Well, there's a woman named Esther who's a Jew. They don't know that yet. Esther chapter 2 actually says she's beautiful in face and form. To put it crassly, she's smoking hot. And they take her. And she's put in this beauty treatment that's going to go on for months. And then they bring these women before the king. And again, remember what we said. This is not a Disney princess story the way it's often promoted when we're little children especially and told the Esther story, and maybe rightly so. But now as adults, we need to recognize this is a disgusting situation. They're forced to have a one-night stand with the king, if you will. The ones who aren't chosen to be queen are basically going to be part of this harem, and they will not see their families again. They'll be in a part of a castle and just put there for use whenever the king decides. It's a disgusting story at this point. And yet we see God working in the midst of this. What a great reminder for you and I, isn't it? That in the midst of the broken evilness of our world, God is working. And so we find ourselves in Esther chapter 2, verse 17. It says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Queen Vashti." Now, don't miss this. You realize that Esther could easily forget who she is. What just took place in Esther's life is she just got what most little girls dream of. Little girls dressing up in their princess costumes and putting a little crown on their head and imagining that they're a beautiful princess and will someday be a queen. That just happened to Esther. The power and the prestige and the treatment that she's going to receive. But here's where this plot of the story starts to thicken, and here's where we start to realize that there's more to Esther than just her beauty. And so the end of chapter 2, there's, and I'm just going to tell you the story really quick with the last 3 verses. So Mordecai, her uncle, remember we were introduced to him as well. He's outside by the gate of the city. He had basically raised Esther, and he's checking on her all the time. And he's outside of the gate of the city, and he hears 2 eunuchs, these guys that have been castrated and part of the king's service. These 2 eunuchs start talking about, hey, you know what we should do? And they unpack this plot to kill King Xerxes. Mordecai overhears it. He tells Esther. Esther tells King Xerxes. But Esther tells King Xerxes that it was my uncle Mordecai that told me about this. They find out it's true. They have the 2 guys hung on the gallows. Here's what you don't want to miss. At the end of chapter 2, it says that King Xerxes had this written down in his logbook. Hang on to that, because that's going to come back near the end of the story. They wrote down that a guy named Mordecai saved the life of a king, of the king. Chapter 3. Now we're introduced to this other character. Now, I said this the first week. There's actually a Jewish feast that is celebrated because of the story of Esther. It's the Feast of Purim. Every year, the Jewish people will gather. They'll celebrate this feast. One of the things they do, I'm going to ask you to do as well. They actually read the story of Esther. But when people come to the Feast of Purim, they will actually write the name Haman. He's who we're going to be introduced to. He's the villain of the story. They'll actually write it on the bottom of their sandals, on the bottom of their shoes. I would put my foot up here to show you, but oh, there, that's pretty good, okay? They write it on the bottom, and then every time they read the name Haman, everybody in the audience stomps their feet as if they're stomping on Haman, and they boo. So, what I want you to do, and I get that you're sitting at home, maybe in your living room or in your kitchen, at the kitchen table or out on your patio, but whenever I read the story, the name Haman in the upcoming verses and for the rest of the series, I want you to do what they do, and we're going to go, boo! Okay, you don't have to write it necessarily, but we're going to boo. So, Esther chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman. Boo! Son of that guy, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. So, this villain is now one of the most powerful men in the most powerful country in the world at that time. Verse 2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. Boo! For the king had commanded this concerning him. Now, once you start learning about Haman, you're going to find out that he must have loved this. The king had given orders that whenever Haman came into the king's gate, that everyone was supposed to bow down to him. And once you get to know Haman, you're going to recognize that his chest probably puffs out and he's like, yeah. But look at this. Check out the end of verse 2. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor. Would not pay him honor. It is really important what happens at the end of verse 4. If you skip down and look at the end of verse 4, we're told that they actually know it's Mordecai. You see, in verse 3 and the beginning of verse 4, these guys start noticing that day after day after day, Mordecai's the only guy that's not bowing, and they take this to Haman and they tell him, hey, there's a guy named Mordecai that's not bowing to you, and by the way, he's one of those pesky Jews that was dragged off into captivity a few decades ago. So look at verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. He's ticked off. He's furious. Remember the scene from Elf? It's a silly scene, but remember when it talks about he's an angry elf. Well, we might say he's an angry Haman, except this isn't silly. This isn't a funny little movie. In fact, look what happens. He's not just angry with Mordecai. Look at verse 6. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the entire kingdom of King Xerxes. This is a genocide. You know the word genocide didn't exist until 1944. A guy by the name of Raphael Lemkin came up with the word. He took a Greek word and a Latin word, two words, combined them, and genocide literally means the deliberate killing of a particular ethnic group. I remember years ago when I was in Rwanda. It's a country in East Africa. I was there on several occasions. And if you've seen Hotel Rwanda or you remember your history, in 1996, a genocide broke out between the two main tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And in 90 days, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered in this little tiny country of Rwanda. And I remember one time when I was up in northern Rwanda and we were kind of waiting outside of a place. It was this dirt parking lot, and I was kicking the dirt, and all of a sudden I uncovered a bone. I don't know if it was a human bone or an animal bone, but what I do know is that in Rwanda, there were so many people that were slaughtered and just dumped in graves that they continue to dig up bones. And if you go to the different genocide museums around Rwanda, there's just big open places where they'll just put more of the bones to give them a proper burial. When I was at the Genocide Museum in the capital city of Rwanda, there was one place that was maybe 5 feet wide and 20 feet long, and there was 20,000 bodies buried. And when I walked through that Genocide Museum, I remember going down one hallway, and it was listing the different genocides of the 20th century. And those famous words that you probably remember after the genocide that you and I are so well aware of, the one with the Jews in World War II, where Adolf Hitler is trying to exterminate the Jews. At the end of that, someone wrote, "Never again." And yet when I kept walking down this hallway, there'd be another story of another genocide the next decade, another story of another genocide the next decade, another story of another genocide the next decade. Every single decade in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, somewhere in our world there has been a genocide. People that were deciding that a certain people group didn't deserve to live anymore and began to plan to slaughter them. This is taking place 2,600 years ago. But what we might miss is that there's been genocides throughout the history of humanity. That's the evilness, the wickedness of humans. But remember, there's already been a prophecy given that the Messiah would come through the line of the Jewish people. And you know who knew that? Satan. If he can eliminate the Jewish people, he will, in a sense, eliminate the coming Messiah. So certainly there's been genocides throughout humanity, but this one was significant. So look at verse 8, skip down to verse 8, Esther chapter 3, verse 8. Then, remember Haman, boo, said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves," circle this word, "separate. Their customs are," circle this word, "different from those of all the other people." You realize that this is how racism and genocides and hatred for other people usually begins. They're different. They look different. They act different. They have different customs. They have different culture. We don't get it. It's weird. And birthed out of that sometimes becomes hatred and eventually what we're seeing right now in our country, racism. He goes to the king. Don't miss this. He goes to the king and he's saying, we have a people group within the Persian Empire that don't exactly look like us or act like us. In fact, he tells him, if you were to read the next few verses, he actually tells him, I'll spend my own money to get rid of them. We need to get rid of them, king. In fact, if you let them go, they're not actually, because of their customs, they're not following some of the rules of this kingdom. So we need to wipe them out, and don't worry about it. I'll do it. In fact, the end of verse 9, he says, I'll give 10,000 talents of silver. Now, that doesn't mean much to you and I, except that that's 340 metric tons of silver. In today's economy, Haman is saying, I will give millions and millions of dollars to wipe these people out of my own money. Shows how powerful, shows how wealthy he was, and it shows how much he hated him. If you exterminate these people, king, I'll foot the bill. But look what happens. Look at verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman. Boo! Now, that's basically like he gave him a blank check. He's going, Haman, no. Let me give you a blank check. That's what it's like. We don't get the signet ring thing now, but what he's basically doing with that is would be like nowadays he's saying, here, Haman, I'm going to sign it. King Xerxes, you fill in the amount. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman. Boo, son of that guy, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman. Boo, and do with the people as you please. Haman, don't use your money. Persia's going to foot the bill to kill all these people. We'll cover the costs. The next few verses actually say, verses 12 through 15, say that there was 11 months from the time that this edict was given to kill every man, woman, and child that was a Jew to the day that it was going to be carried out. There was 11 months. That is not an act of grace on Haman's part or King Xerxes' part. It takes a while to plan the extermination of humans. If you read about what took place in World War II, some of the Germans under Adolf Hitler had plotted for quite a while, and it took a lot to try to figure out how to exterminate an entire people group. The 11 months is what's needed for them to put the things in place to kill every man, woman, and child that was a Jew. Now, jump down to verse 15. This is how chapter 3 closes. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command. The edict was issued in the citadel of Susa, the capital. The king and Haman, boo, sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. You could write a book on the leadership failures of King Xerxes. I mean, from the very beginning, he's trying to get his wife to come in, and she doesn't want to come in and dance naked in front of a bunch of drunken men. And so then he goes to a bunch of his sexist men who give him ideas, and he's like, oh, that's a good idea, And now he gives an edict to wipe out an entire people group, and it doesn't even make sense to his own people. They're bewildered, and he and Haman are sitting in the palace, cheers. Hey, buddy, 11 months from now, we're going to wipe out every man, woman, and child. The problem sometimes is when we read stories like this and we think of an entire people group, or when we read about World War II and we're talking about 6 million Jews, that number's so big that we just can't wrap our minds around it. Sometimes what you have to do is try to put a face to the story. I remember going to the museum in D.C. and seeing the rooms full of shoes. And I remember I couldn't even talk because I saw little shoes like this big. And I'm like, there was little feet. There was a little boy or a little girl's feet that once filled those shoes. And they were killed. And it was room after room just filled with shoes. That's what's going to happen. Here's, I think, where we're at in this story at the end of Esther chapter 3. Here's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. How do we deal with the evil in this world? This happened 2,600 years ago, but this world's no less evil, is it? In fact, what we're seeing right now in our country are injustices, some of these systemic injustices that have been going on for hundreds of years. Some of the systemic injustices to certain people group in our countries started 200 years before we were even a country, before we were officially a country. And it begs the question, what do you and I as Jesus followers do with the evil in our world? So I'd love if you guys spend some time when we're finished just wrestling with some of these things, but let me give you a couple of things to just talk about. One of them is this: we don't have a choice. Not if you're a Jesus follower. You don't have a choice. Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires, not recommends, not requests, what the Lord requires of you to do justice. We don't have a choice. You and I, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, it's not like, you know what? I just don't like to deal with justice issues. They're too messy. People get mad. We don't have a choice. God said, if you claim to be a follower of mine, this is what I'm requiring you to do, to act justly. And if you actually took this Bible from cover to cover, you'll see that over 2,000 times It will speak to the heart of God towards justice. In fact, there were some seminary students that once took a Bible and they were going to physically cut out every single verse in the Bible that had to do with justice or injustices. And by the time they got done with the Bible and they held it up, it just fell apart because there were 2,000 chunks of this that were cut out. What does that display? That from cover to cover, God cares about the oppressed. Over and over again, he's saying, take care of the widows and the orphans. And the widows and orphans back then represented the oppressed. Today, if it were to be written today, he'd be saying, take care of any person or people group that is being oppressed, that is downtrodden, that is marginalized. We live in a world that is still so full of evil. And I know if you're like me, sometimes you look around and you look at the racism going on and you're like, where do we even start? Or human trafficking. I battled human trafficking for years and started a safe house here in Phoenix for girls that were rescued. And I remember when we were making our documentary and riding around with our Vice Squad, and I learned that this wasn't happening just on the other side of the world, but tonight, just down the road from where you're sitting, there's going to be a 13 or a 14-year-old girl that's raped for profit. And it'll happen to her night after night after night. It begs the question again, then what do we do? Well, we have to do something. I don't remember who gave this quote. I used to quote it all the time. I can remember the quote, and I can't remember who wrote it. But he said that the part of the malady of our culture and discipleship's efforts is this tragic rationale that if we can't do everything, we can't do anything, and so we become paralyzed and inert. And the problem for you and I sometimes is we look around at all the injustices in the world, the evil in the world, and we're like, I don't even know where to start. And so we just don't do anything. And the truth is you and I can't do everything, but we can do something. And so I would just encourage you, even in the state that we're finding our country right now, you have to do something. I don't know what it is for you, but don't become paralyzed. Don't become inert. Don't become overwhelmed with, I don't know where to start. Just do something. Maybe you just start by praying and asking God. What we're going to see is the story of Esther is a display of the power of what one person can do. I actually believe that you and I, as citizens of the United States, have a for such a time moment as this right now in our country. The story of Esther is that Mordecai, as we're going to see in coming chapters, is going to say, Esther, you were placed here for such a time as this. I think we're in one of those moments in our country. If we will stand for justice, we right now could be living in a for such a time moment in the history of this country. You can't do everything, but you can do something. What is it that God is calling you to do? Jesus, thank you for this amazing story. What an amazing story, and what an amazing woman this Esther was. I can't wait to meet her someday and just sit down and visit with her. What a hero she was. Mordecai, what a hero he was. And the reason they were heroes is they refused to remain silent. They refused to not do something. They refused to, in their case, even put their life on the line. And God, you've called us to do the same, to act justly, to do something. And God, would we as your followers be marked as people who care deeply about the things that you care about, that weep over the things that make you weep, Jesus, that will do something. We love you, Jesus. Amen.